Welcome to This Week in South Carolina. I'm Gavin Jackson. With the 2020 South Carolina presidential primary less than 2 months away, we've seen more candidates drop out of the race and clear frontrunners maintain their leads. Many of those frontrunners are continuously visiting South Carolina, showing why the first in the South primary is vital to each candidate's future. With less than 7 weeks until the February 29th Democratic presidential primary, former Vice President Joe Biden has maintained his lead in South Carolina, as he has throughout 2019. The state is expected to be a crucial firewall for Biden amid closer poll numbers in Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada. Vermont Independent Senator Bernie Sanders blew out the entire field in the last 3 months by fundraising $34.5 million. That followed an impressive $25 million in the third quarter. The money is critical to the organization efforts and advertising in states like South Carolina. Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren continues to jockey back and forth with Sanders for third place in polling. While raising $21 million last quarter, she and Biden still lag behind Sanders in campaign visits to the state. Former South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg maintains strong fundraising, but hasn't gained much traction in the Palmetto State, and neither has New Jersey Senator Cory Booker. This while billionaires like Tom Steyer spend millions of dollars to saturate the airwaves, internet, and even billboards with their message. South Carolina plays a significant role in selecting the future presidential nominees and is the focus of a new book, First in the South, Why South Carolina's Presidential Primary Matters, by Gibbs and Jordan Ragusa, a must-read for understanding this critical process. Joining us to discuss the importance of the First in the South primary are College of Charleston political science professors Gibbs and Jordan Ragusa, the authors of the newly released book, First in the South, Why South Carolina's Presidential Primary Matters. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much.
Gibbs, why does this presidential primary matter? I know it's a little on the nose there, but I want to talk to you about, how it came to be that we play this outsized role. Obviously, the Democratic presidential primaries are right around the corner, but This book is about both the Democrats and the Republicans. Kind of walk us down how we got to where we are.
Yeah, so basically in the late 1970s, almost everybody in South Carolina was a Democrat. There weren't a lot of Republicans, and the Republican Party was trying to figure out a way to become relevant, to get more people to think of them as Republicans. So they kind of had an outlandish idea. They said, we should have a presidential primary, and we should make it the first Southern primary. And they had a lot of opposition. The Democrats said they couldn't do it, but they made it happen. In 1980, the South Carolina Republicans supported Ronald Reagan. That catapulted him to the nomination. He became a two-term president, and really the rest is history. Eventually, the Democrats had the first in the South primary in 2004, but it took them a while. And it's important because it's an early primary, just like Iowa, which has a caucus, New Hampshire, Nevada now in South Carolina. So it's one of those 4 carve-out states. And so it has a real big impact on who stays in the race, who does well, who builds momentum. And it's also important because it's the first Southern primary, and a lot of Southern states come right afterwards. And South Carolina's been a really good barometer. I mean, if you do well in South Carolina, you're probably going to do well in Georgia. You're probably going to do well in some other Southern states.
But Joy, there was pushback when we look back at the beginning. We talked about the 80s. They were worried about Reagan, especially with the TV appearance and how kind of all this became more of a media circus, which in some ways is true today. It has kind of transformed into becoming that, for better or for worse, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's some questions about whether voters should have a say in who a party nominates for president. I mean, some people favor a system where the parties just make their own internal decision and let voters decide in the general election. There were also questions in the lead up to the first primary whether it was actually legal, and some Democrats actually made the case that the Republicans were violating state law in doing so. So certainly without controversy now, both sides agree that it's important and that it's a good thing for the state.
Yes, and Strom Thurmond, Governor Edwards, they did not want to have a primary. I mean, Edwards felt like it was better to hold back those delegates and make a bigger splash at the national convention. Strom Thurmond was backing Governor Conley in Texas and didn't think he would do as well if there was a primary. And so, you had these sort of major Republican figures in South Carolina opposed to the primary, and it was really a grassroots effort. It was the GOP chairman, this guy named Dan Ross, who kind of made it happen. He was the person who kind of came up with the idea and shepherded it through.
But for the Democrats, it was a little bit more kicky and screaming with the national party, to get them to have that
It
first.
was, yeah. I mean, so the National Democratic Party didn't want them to have anything before March 1st. And so, they were saying, look, the Republicans are killing us here. They have this early primary. We're not becoming relevant. We've got to have something. And the National Democrats would say, no, you can't have anything before March 1st. And so it was a lot of tension. Democrats had a caucus. And again, that allows the party elites and the folks that are in the party to have more of an impact. When you go to a caucus, you kind of have to publicly display who you support. A primary, you go in, in the old days, you pulled the curtain back and there was a secret ballot. And so, there's some differences between what the Democrats were doing. And it's not like we didn't in the book say that primaries are the way to go. We took the approach that, the primary system is what we have. South Carolina has this really important primary. Let's try to figure out how it came about and why it's been such a good predictor of who eventually wins the nomination.
And Jordan, kind of along that vein, tell me why it is so important. We can look at, I do want to focus a bit more on the Democrats since we have that primary coming up, but it's obviously important, especially when we look at the Republicans, because they have had such a good track record at predicting the nominee. But when we talk about early voting, why it matters compared to, our neighboring states that, vote after we do, what advantage does that give us to be an early voting state?
Yeah, it gives us a lot of advantages. First and most obvious, we have a disproportionate say over who ultimately becomes the Democratic or Republican nominee. There's a lot of good research on momentum effects in primary elections, where if you do well in an early state, voters in subsequent states perceive you to be electorally viable, and because we all want to back a winner, that candidate that's doing well early on is likely to get a lot of votes subsequently. So it's good for us because we have a lot of power over who becomes the Democratic and Republican nominee. It's also good for us potentially downstream in terms of things like getting federal funding. There's research on whether states are supporters or opponents of the president, and people have matched that up to things like federal disaster assistance. So it benefits us in that way. Financially, it also benefits us financially in that people are here in South Carolina spending a lot of money on campaign ads, just on things like hotel stays and food. So it's financially good for us in addition to politically good for us.
But when it comes to the different races there, Gibbs, we're looking at the Democrats and the Republicans. When we look at the history, the perspective of how accurate they are now. I don't know if that means we're good or bad, but what's the track record like for both of those parties?
So for the Republicans, every time but 2012, they've gotten it right. And we define get it right by actually picking the winner of the nomination, not the person who ultimately becomes president, but only in 2012 when South Carolina voters went for Newt Gingrich. Eventually Mitt Romney was the nominee. They were perfect in every other instance. The Democrats haven't had quite as strong of a track record. In the last 4 elections, 3 of the 4 they've gotten it right. In 2004, Democrats backed John Edwards, who was a senator from North Carolina, who was from South Carolina. Of course, John Kerry was the eventual nominee. He picked John Edwards as his VP, and so probably maybe that South Carolina boost that he got in the South Carolina and some other southern states might have gotten him more on John Kerry's radar screen and maybe helped him secure that VP nomination. So the Republicans have really gotten it right. And one of the things we look at is we try to figure out, okay, well, why is that? Is it just luck? Are we just lucky here in South Carolina? Or is there something about the South Carolina Republican electorate that's representative of the National Republican Party? And we actually looked at a bunch of old exit poll data and kind of tried to say, okay, what does the typical South Carolina Republican look like? What does the typical National Republican primary voter look like? And I think it was, we were the 3rd most representative state. And we think that South Carolina's Republican predictive accuracy has a lot to do with how representative the Republicans. There's just a good mix. There's Christian conservatives, there's pro-business folks, there's just a lot of kind of a good mix of Republicans in South Carolina.
Which is especially different from the way Iowa's broken up, at least for Republicans.
That's right. That's exactly right.
But when we look at the Democrats, and we're not exactly representative of that, Jordan, but we are also a counterweight, which is important for South Carolina, especially the other early voting states. So how does that match up when we're talking about a great representation of the Republican Party in South Carolina, but not quite so the Democratic Party in South Carolina?
It's interesting. In both cases, on the Republican side and on the Democratic side, the key is that South Carolina is diverse. As Gibbs mentioned, on the Republican side, we're talking about diversity in terms of issue priorities, born-again Christians, things of that nature. On the Democratic side, we're talking about literal diversity, racial diversity. Iowa and New Hampshire are disproportionately white. By most estimates, only about 2% of Democrats in Iowa and New Hampshire are African American. In South Carolina, it's well over 50%. Obviously, that's really important in the Democratic Party, given that race is so important to its platform, but also in terms of the fact that African Americans are a large percentage of Democratic voters. So it's interesting that it's diversity on both sides, but just different kinds of diversity. And so South Carolina ends up being the counterweight that you described, and that's really important.
But when we look at the national Democratic Party overall, you would think that we do have a diverse Democratic Party here in South Carolina, but again, that's not exactly representative of the national Democratic Party too.
No, it's definitely not true in all states. That's right. Yep.
Gotcha. But when we're talking about the predictability of South Carolina, especially Republicans, so with the Democrats.
Right.
Does that mean that we kind of sometimes do get brushed aside? I mean, you talk about in the book how we don't get enough attention in South Carolina. Is that one of the reasons, or what are some of the reasons why maybe we don't get the same spotlight?
I mean, I think Iowa and New Hampshire have just always been the focus. I mean, when we look from an academic perspective, there have been multiple books about Iowa, multiple books about New Hampshire, and we sort of looked at each other and we said, no one's really written a book about the South Carolina presidential primary. We need to try to be the folks who do that. And I think that's part of it. And I just think that we're a little bit newer to the game. Iowa and New Hampshire were more established, and it was also that the Democrats were kind of late to the party, so to speak, here in South Carolina. I mean, it's been a Republican story for the most part. I mean, the Republican Party, were the ones who branded the primary the first in the South primary, and that's what's crazy about 2020 is that there's not a Republican primary going on. There's this Democratic primary, even though really it was initially something the Republican Party in South Carolina deserves a lot of credit for making it happen, because it wasn't an easy thing to do.
And we are a cheaper media market too, and for advertising purposes. But I'm guessing we just don't see the same amount of people coming through here too. So is that a matter of us maybe trying to do better, or maybe give them more attention, or just is it the chicken and egg type situation?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I think that, one of the advantages of all three states, Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, is that it makes it possible for less well-known candidates to campaign and compete in cheap media markets and in states that have accessible populations, because you can drive from one side to the other for a day of campaigning. I mean, if we had a system like a national primary, candidates would do what they do in general elections. They would focus on large states, and that may potentially crowd out some of the smaller candidates. So that's one of the virtues of the existing system and South Carolina's role in it.
Yeah, definitely want to talk about the future of the primary, but before we get there, when we look at Iowa, we look at New Hampshire, how much can we take on what happens in those states before South Carolina? It's all happening in February this year. How much of that have you determined? Does that predict any success for candidates in South Carolina, or specifically Democrats, Gibbs?
Yeah, so South Carolina is more predictive than both Iowa and New Hampshire. That's for sure. Iowa and New Hampshire are interesting because they a lot of times will split. One candidate will win Iowa, another candidate will win New Hampshire, and South Carolina has oftentimes played a tie-breaking role. So it's kind of like, okay, you've got these two, who's going to win, and then this is sort of the third round of a particular primary. So that's been. But I don't know. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that we do in the book is we try to talk about what does it take to win the South Carolina primary, and we explicitly look at this question of how does a victory or a good performance in Iowa and New Hampshire translate into South Carolina. And what we find is that Iowa translates really well into South Carolina, but only on the Republican side. And as best we can tell, we think that's because there's a lot of social conservatives in both states. What we see is that in all the other instances, there's not much of an effect. I mean, obviously you want to do well if you're a Democrat in Iowa or a Democrat or a Republican in New Hampshire, but it doesn't have nearly as sizable effect in South Carolina. Our estimate is that there's about a 6% advantage if you do really well in New Hampshire and Iowa if you're a Democrat in South Carolina. So it really the big effect is on the Republican side in Iowa.
Yeah, because we look at, you're talking about, Obama winning Iowa in 2008, then Clinton having, New Hampshire, Nevada, but then Obama against springboarding from Iowa in South Carolina.
That's right.
Do you think people are trying to, emulate that strategy this time around too? I mean, obviously Joe Biden has a pretty steady lock on South Carolina, but do you see people trying to emulate that with, hey, if I can blow it out in Iowa some way, that can help.
Yeah, I mean, I thought initially when Kamala Harris was putting a lot in Iowa, I mean, I sort of thought she was trying to run kind of a similar strategy as Obama, sort of beat expectations in Iowa, perhaps win, and then come to South Carolina and do really well. I mean, she's out of the race now. And so this election has been really different because you've had, Joe Biden, who's done, been up in the polls in South Carolina, and almost seems like, no matter what happens nationally, his numbers still look pretty good here. What we don't have as much of a sense of, it's going to be fascinating to watch unfold over the next, 6 weeks or so, is how solid is that support? Is there anything that can happen? Could a result in Iowa and New Hampshire maybe change a little bit and cause some of that support for Biden to weaken a little bit?
Yeah, and if you come in, South Carolina and maybe didn't do so hot, but it seems like what we're seeing right now in the polls in Iowa is there's already a three-way tie. It seems like with Biden, with Bernie Sanders, and Mayor Pete Buttigieg. So I'm wondering if it's not an entire blowout in some of these places, does that say, okay, well, he's faring well, he's faring well?
I think like Bill Clinton, he sort of exceeded expectations early on and then came to South Carolina as a Southern governor and did pretty well in 1992 and won the primary. And so something like that where Biden, I think of Biden, is he like Hillary Clinton in 2008 or Hillary Clinton in 2016? This sort of long-standing Democratic person. And if he's more like Hillary Clinton in 2016, it's going to be very good for Joe Biden in South Carolina. People thought Hillary Clinton was going to win the South Carolina primary in 2008, but Obama did better than expected, ended up winning Iowa, and I think people looked and said, if he can win in a state like Iowa, we got to give him a second look, and ended up doing really well in South Carolina.
And that kind of goes back to what I want to talk about is it's not all about money, and it's not about previous campaigning too. Jordan, so what are these ingredients for success in South Carolina? Because you don't have to be a high quality candidate, i.e. someone that was in office before, kind of just, I don't know what you need to do in South Carolina.
Yeah, I mean, so we talk about some of the virtues of the South Carolina primary, and one that I already mentioned is that, lesser known candidates that are not as well funded as someone like Tom Steyer can actually compete and win in South Carolina. So when we look at what it takes to win the South Carolina primary, surprisingly, we find that campaign spending actually does not have much of an effect. But if you look at some past races, I mean, it sort of makes sense. 2016 is a great example. Jeb Bush grossly outspent his Republican opponents, including Donald Trump, who spent very little, yet Donald Trump got the nomination and ultimately became president. It's the same thing with political experience. There are a number of candidates who haven't had prior political experience. They haven't run for elective office at all or in South Carolina in a past primary, yet they've done really well. Donald Trump is, of course, an example of that as well. So we think that's one of the virtues of the South Carolina primary. It's some of the things that actually don't matter. In terms of what does matter, some sort of obvious things, endorsements matter a lot. Candidates compete really hard to secure key statewide endorsements. And what we see is that those actually do have a sizable effect. Media attention really matters. So when we talk about 2012, when Newt Gingrich got the nomination, it's the one time that South Carolina Republicans got it wrong. Some people think that he had two rock-solid debate performances, got a lot of media attention afterwards, and ultimately that maybe propelled him to victory. So those things matter. We know that race matters a lot in Democratic contests. Barack Obama's 2008 victory is sort of an obvious example of that.
Yeah, you did mention that black candidates have a sizable advantage, especially the Democratic field.
And all I was going to say was, so we would get reporters, and you'd call us up and say, what does it take to win in South Carolina? And we would, take what we learned in school and try to look at the literature and make our best guess. But one of the things we did for this book, and we devoted an entire chapter to it, is we went back and took the 50, 60 plus people that have ever been a candidate in South Carolina on the Democratic and Republican side, and then we went and said, how much money did they raise? How much media coverage did they get? We of course know what their vote total was, and we did some statistical analyses to be able to figure out what are these, so we can be a little more educated about, and have a little more backing for some of these conclusions that we can say pretty solidly an African American candidate, is going to do this much better compared to sort of a candidate who's not African American. A candidate who gets this many endorsements is going to do this much better. And so that's kind of one of the fun things we got got to do is we feel like we've got a little more, for folks out there that want to know more about the primary, they can go and say, whether it's a candidate or just somebody who's really interested, here are the things it takes to win in South Carolina, based on all the races that have happened back to 1980.
And did polls, I don't think you quoted, but did polls make a difference? And did they trend? Did they follow, did the vote turn out the way polls were kind of showing them to be?
Yeah. I mean, there's really two ways of forecasting an election. One is to just look at what the polls are saying. The other way is to do essentially what we did, is plug some factors into an analysis and see what
the hard work versus the
hard work.
fun,
yes, very hard
race.
work. Well, it's a labor of love.
Right.
And both are accurate. They have pros and cons. I mean, polls are accurate as long as people tell you the truth, and what we know about polling is that people don't always tell the truth. Our analyses, are fairly accurate, but they have their own trade-offs. Measuring some of these things can prove challenging. So, they're all accurate with trade-offs.
And I want to just talk about the primaries themselves. When we talk about, ours are different because we have Saturday voting.
That's right.
And we have open primaries too. So can you just touch a little bit about how that affects the whole process?
Yeah, so the Saturday voting thing is kind of fun. So back to when the Republicans, in the late 70s, they said, we want to have a Saturday primary. They were very purposeful about that. And they wanted to, it wasn't run by the State Board of Elections, so they had to get volunteers in each county. And there weren't a lot of Republicans in some of these counties, so getting volunteers was tough. And they said, if we do a Saturday primary, we can get volunteers. And they wanted it to be the working man's primary, is what they said. They want to make sure the Republican primary is the working man's primary. And so, it's just been always on Saturday, and I think it has, had an impact. I think it's probably allowed people to, not have to miss work and be able to help volunteers and things like that. I think it's also interesting that the primaries have not been on the same date. We don't have a Democratic primary. We have a Democratic primary, but not a Republican primary this time. But they've not, except for in one instance, been on the same day. Usually the Republicans go first, and then the Democrats come a little bit afterwards.
And it's open, so if obviously Republicans could vote in this.
That's right. Yeah. So there's some good questions about that. That's a great point. So basically, we don't register by party in South Carolina. When you go register to vote in North Carolina, you have to say, I'm registering as a Democrat, I'm registering as an unaffiliated, or I'm registering as a Republican. Here in South Carolina, you don't. So you can show up. You're not supposed to vote in two primaries if we had two presidential primaries in one election, but anybody who is a South Carolina registered voter, they can go show up at the Democratic primary on February 29th and cast a ballot. And so, we think open primaries are a good thing. We think they're more reflective of kind of what the national state or the state voter, reflective of what the state voter believes. And so, I don't think we don't recommend going to some kind of closed primary system.
And with 5 minutes left, I want to touch on two more things. Sure. And we are a proportional state too when it comes to Democrats. So that's also an advantage for some of these candidates. When we look at the poll numbers right now, the most recent stuff shows Biden at 27%, Sanders at 20%, Warren at 19%. If they maintain those, they're going to, if they get that safe 15% margin, those second and third place winners, whoever they may be, could easily still walk away with some delegates, which matters in the overall scheme of how the primary works for the Democrats versus Republicans, where it's winner take all.
Right. Yeah, I mean, having a proportional system, it's one of those things that is good for the candidates, but maybe not so good for the party as a whole. The party would like to wrap up the nomination sooner rather than later. They would not like to drag it out, maybe into, May, say. But by having a proportional system, if you get, a close second or a close third, you may still be viable going into the Super Tuesday states and beyond. So, yeah.
Another reason why we still have about 12 candidates in this race, 12, 13.
Right. Yeah.
Marianne Williamson seems like she's winding down. We just saw Julian Castro drop out.
Right.
But Gibbs, kind of wrapping up, I want to ask you about the future of this primary. We always talk about Iowa. Why is Iowa first? Why is New Hampshire first when they're not representative? What's the future of South Carolina's primary?
Right. So we think it's probably gonna be here for a good time to come, and that is because states it would take a lot for Congress to pass some kind of law to have a national primary. There'd be questions about whether states could be told they had to even comply, and so I just don't think the momentum's there's enough other issues that our country's talking about to sort of reform the primary system, and so I think we're probably going to be stuck with this system for a little while, and again we think there are some real virtues to South Carolina. Its predictive ability on the Republican side, how representative it is on the Democratic side, and the fact fact that it allows candidates to come, not necessarily with the most money, but if they work hard, if they do an event in Greenville, drive to Columbia, and then drive down to Charleston, they can really cover the state in a day, like Jordan said. And so there are a lot of positives of the way we pick presidential nominees here.
But when you talk about us being a counterweight, what if Iowa and New Hampshire were to be removed, and then South Carolina maybe not necessarily counterweight if you have more diverse states like Georgia, which I found interesting in your book that you're saying Georgia is really closely mirrors the National Democratic Party, and they're also more successful in predicting the election. Obviously, they go later in March, so they have that ability to see a more a lean field. But I'm wondering, could that be a possibility where we see someone like Georgia trying to jump ahead of us like they did in 1992?
Yeah. So the national parties have made South Carolina, along with Iowa, New Hampshire, and now Nevada as these special carve-out states. So other states can schedule their primary whenever they want, but there are sanctions that the national party could implement on them if they decide to do that. So will they do that in the future? I mean, it's possible, but I think it's sort of not likely. I think South Carolina's place is secure for now.
And just with about a minute left, we got February 29th right around the corner. Gibbs, what are we going to be seeing going forward with this, and what can we expect in the next few weeks?
Just continued more candidate visits. Again, I'd say for folks watching this, go out and see candidates if you haven't already. There's such great opportunities. You don't have to get in some long line for the most part. There might be a dozen people at some events. There might be, hundreds or, even more at some of the more popular candidates. But, we're going to see an increase in candidate visits, and really the story is going to be, can Joe Biden hold this lead? He seems strong in South Carolina. Senator Marlin Kimpson just endorsed him yesterday. That's a key endorsement, and we know that endorsements matter. But trying to see that is Joe Biden able to hold this lead?
Gotcha. Well, thanks to Gibbs and Jordan for being here today, and thank you for joining us. Also, check out the South Carolina Lead. It's a political podcast that can be found wherever you find podcasts. Each week, I recap the weekly political news with reporters who cover it. From the Kennedy Greenhouse Studio on the campus of the University of South Carolina, I'm Gavin Jackson.